I need to tell you something tonight, something that could change how you see me forever. Because a few hours ago, my father sat across from me in the quietest room in our house, the kind of silence that only happens when something serious has already happened. He didn't smile, he didn't joke, he didn't even ask how my day was. Instead, he looked at me with the kind of calm focus that makes you realize a decision has already been made somewhere behind the scenes. And then he said your name, not gently, not casually, but with the weight of someone who has been studying a mystery for weeks, maybe months. And in that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten. My father had been investigating you. Now, before you feel hurt hearing that, before you think this is some cold calculation or some test you didn't sign up for, you need to understand the world I grew up in. In our family, love was never something people trusted easily. Feelings were considered dangerous, unpredictable forces that could destroy a man's judgment. My father spent his entire life believing that emotions were the enemy of clear thinking. So when he realized there was a woman who had somehow changed the way his son spoke, the way his son paused mid-sentence, and stared out the window like he was remembering something beautiful, he didn't react with curiosity. He reacted with suspicion. Because the man who raised me believes that when a woman enters a man's heart that deeply, something powerful is happening behind the surface, and powerful things deserve investigation. So yes, he looked into you, quietly, carefully. The way a man studies a complicated machine before trusting it to fly through the sky. He asked questions. He watched patterns. He learned about your past, your choices, the way you speak to people when no one important is watching. And the strange part, the part that has been echoing in my head all night, is that I didn't try to stop him. I told myself it was because arguing with my father is pointless. But the truth is a little more uncomfortable than that. Part of me was afraid of what he might find, because loving someone the way I'm starting to love you means risking the possibility that I'm wrong about everything. Have you ever loved someone and felt that quiet fear that maybe your heart is seeing something that reality might not confirm? When he finally finished talking, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. The room felt heavier than it should have. I remember noticing the sound of the clock on the wall, every tick suddenly loud, like time itself was waiting for his answer. And then he said something that surprised me more than anything else tonight. He said, "Son, if you're going to risk your heart on someone, at least choose a woman whose character survives investigation." And then he nodded once. Just once. That was it. In my father's language, that nod means approval. But instead of feeling relief, I felt something else entirely, something deeper, something more complicated. Because when a man like my father approves of someone you love, it forces you to confront a much scarier question. What if this is actually real? What if the woman I've been cautiously letting into my thoughts, the woman I keep imagining beside me in quiet future moments, isn't just a beautiful possibility, but a permanent turning point in my life? Because approval sounds simple on the surface. But approval means the door just opened to something irreversible. And irreversible things have always made me nervous. Tell me something honestly. If someone looked at your entire life, every mistake, every quiet act of kindness, every moment when you thought no one was watching, and then said you were worthy of being loved deeply, would that make you feel safe? Or would it make you feel exposed? Because tonight, when my father approved of you, it didn't just validate you. It forced me to face the reality that I might actually have to stop protecting myself. That loving you might require something I've avoided my entire life, the willingness to lose control of the outcome. And the strange thing is, I don't think I've told you the most important part of this story yet. The part that explains why my father's investigation didn't start with curiosity, but with a warning he gave me about you weeks ago. A warning that almost made me walk away from you completely. But before I tell you that, let me ask you something small, something simple. If you've been listening this far, quietly sitting with me in this strange confession, subscribe and tell me where in the world you're hearing my voice tonight, because something tells me this story might end up mattering to both of us more than we expected. And the truth is, the reason my father started looking into you in the first place wasn't because he doubted you. It was because of something he believed about me. Something he said the night he first saw your picture. And when I repeat those words to you, you might understand why I almost disappeared from your life before this love even had a chance to exist. When my father first saw your picture, the room changed in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no sudden judgment. Just a long pause that stretched across the table between us like a silent question neither of us wanted to ask out loud. He studied your face carefully, the way he studies complicated blueprints when something about the design seems unusual. And then he looked at me in that quiet, analytical way he has always had, the kind of look that makes you feel like he's not just seeing you, he's measuring you. "Son," he said slowly, "this woman is not the dangerous one." And I remember thinking that sentence sounded almost reassuring until he finished it. "You are." That sentence stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because my father wasn't warning me about you. He was warning you about me. He believes something about men like me, men who build things, chase impossible ideas, obsess over the future the way other people obsess over comfort. He believes we love differently. Not weaker, but riskier. We fall deeply, but we also disappear into our ambitions, into our missions, into the storms of our own minds. And he said something that made me uncomfortable in a way I didn't expect. He said a woman with a steady heart, a woman who understands loyalty, patience, and quiet strength, can be hurt by a man who lives in constant motion. And when he said that, I realized something terrifying, because the woman he was describing sounded exactly like you. Tell me something honestly, have you ever felt that strange instinct inside you when you meet someone whose life moves faster than yours? Someone whose thoughts are always racing toward the horizon while you're standing there, holding something much more fragile, the present moment. Because loving someone like that can feel like trying to hold the wind in your hands. Beautiful, powerful, but impossible to control. And the truth is, when my father looked at your photo, he didn't see danger in you. He saw goodness. The kind of goodness that doesn't protect itself very well. The kind that trusts slowly, loves deeply, and doesn't play games with people's hearts. And that's exactly why he started asking questions. Not to test you, but to understand whether I deserved you. The strange part is that his investigation started revealing things about you that I hadn't even noticed yet. Small details, quiet patterns. The way you treat people who can offer you nothing in return. The way you stay calm when conversations become uncomfortable, instead of raising your voice. The way you seem to carry your past with dignity instead of bitterness. My father pays attention to those things. In his world, character is measured by how someone behaves when no one important is watching. And every report he heard about you seemed to say the same thing, that you are exactly the same person in private as you are in public. That kind of consistency is rare. And rare things scare people like my father. But the more he spoke about you, the more uneasy I became. Not because he was finding problems, but because he wasn't. You see, when a man expects to uncover flaws, and instead discovers something beautiful, something genuine, something emotionally steady, it forces him to confront a question he didn't want to face. What if the risk is not falling for the wrong person, but failing to love the right one properly? That question has been echoing in my mind all night. Because loving you doesn't feel like a casual decision anymore. It feels like standing at the edge of something permanent. And permanence is something I've always been careful with. Have you ever noticed how people who build big futures are often terrible at building small, quiet moments? My father knows that about me. That's why, when he finished telling me what he had learned about you, he leaned forward and said something that sounded less like advice and more like a challenge. He said, "Son, if this woman is as genuine as she appears to be, you don't get to love her halfway." And that sentence landed on me heavier than any criticism he's ever given me, because loving someone halfway is easy. Anyone can do that. But loving someone fully, consistently, responsibly, that requires a level of emotional courage I'm not sure I've ever practiced before. And the strange truth is, there's something else my father discovered about you during that investigation. Something small at first glance, but the moment he told me about it, I felt this sudden, quiet shift in my chest. The kind of shift that happens when a piece of information suddenly changes how you see someone. I've been debating all evening whether I should tell you about it now, or wait, because once you hear it, you might realize that our story didn't begin the day we met. It may have started much earlier than either of us understood. And when I tell you what he found, you might start wondering if fate has been playing a much longer game with us than we realized. The strange detail my father uncovered wasn't dramatic at first. It wasn't some secret, some scandal, some hidden chapter that would shake everything apart. In fact, when he first mentioned it, he spoke about it almost casually, like someone pointing out a coincidence that probably meant nothing. But the longer I sat with it, the more it refused to feel like coincidence. He said he noticed a pattern in the way your life had unfolded, the places you had lived, the timing of certain choices, the people whose paths briefly crossed yours. And the unsettling part was how often those moments seemed to brush against my world without either of us realizing it. Not directly, but close enough to make you pause, close enough to make you wonder how two lives can orbit the same space for years without colliding until the exact moment they're supposed to. I remember leaning forward when he told me that, trying to keep my voice calm, even though something inside me had started moving in a way I couldn't explain. Because the truth is, I've always been suspicious of destiny. I trust engineering, logic, physics, things that can be measured and proven. But when my father quietly laid out those strange intersections between your past and mine, I felt something that logic couldn't easily dismiss. He showed me moments where you had been within a few miles of where I was working years ago, moments where you attended events that people in my world had attended too, moments where decisions you made unknowingly shifted the direction of your life in ways that eventually placed you directly in front of mine. And I realized something unsettling. Our story didn't begin the day we started speaking. It began years earlier, quietly assembling itself in the background. Have you ever looked back at your life and suddenly realized how many small decisions had to align perfectly for you to meet someone? One different job choice, one delayed trip, one conversation that never happened, and the entire future rearranges itself. That thought has been sitting with me tonight in a way that feels almost overwhelming. Because when I think about all the possible directions my life could have taken, the number of timelines where you and I never meet is probably enormous. Yet somehow here we are. And when my father pointed that out, he didn't say it with wonder. He said it with concern, because in his mind, patterns like that mean one thing: emotional gravity. And emotional gravity can be powerful enough to pull two people together even when they're not fully prepared for what that connection will demand from them. He looked at me carefully after explaining all of this and asked a question that caught me off guard. He asked whether I understood the responsibility of being loved by someone whose life had already endured its share of storms, because he had also learned about the difficult seasons you've survived, the quiet strength it took for you to rebuild yourself after moments that could have hardened your heart, but somehow didn't. And hearing him describe those parts of your story made something shift inside me. Not admiration alone, something deeper than that. Respect. The kind of respect that makes a man realize the woman he's speaking to isn't fragile at all. She's simply chosen kindness instead of bitterness. And that choice is far rarer than people think. But here's the part that made my chest tighten. My father didn't end that conversation by praising you. He ended it by asking whether I was prepared for what loving someone like you actually means, because women who carry quiet resilience often don't ask for much. They don't demand constant reassurance or dramatic promises. But when they finally trust someone, when they finally open that guarded part of their heart, they expect one thing that many men fail to provide: consistency. Not excitement, not grand gestures, just presence. The steady, patient presence of someone who doesn't disappear when life becomes complicated. And when he said that, I felt something uncomfortable creeping into my thoughts. Because consistency is not something men like me have always been known for. Tell me honestly, have you ever cared about someone and wondered if their life might eventually pull them away from you? Not because they stopped loving you, but because their world moves too fast, too unpredictably, for love to stay safely in the center of it. That fear has been sitting quietly in my mind tonight, because loving you doesn't feel like a casual chapter in my story anymore. It feels like a turning point, and turning points demand choices. Real ones, the kind that quietly close other doors. But there's something else my father said before the conversation ended, something I haven't told you yet. Something that completely changed the direction of that investigation. Because after he approved of you, after he acknowledged the strength of your character, he admitted something unexpected. He said there was one moment during his research when he thought I might actually fall in love with the wrong woman entirely. And the reason he believed that is something I'm not sure you're ready to hear yet. When my father admitted that he once believed I might fall in love with the wrong woman, the room grew quieter than it had been all evening. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like a truth is approaching that you may not want to hear. He looked down at the table for a moment, slowly tracing a line on the wood with his finger, as if he were deciding whether telling me this would help me or hurt me. And then he finally said it. There was another woman whose path briefly crossed mine months ago. Someone who appeared, on the surface, to be perfectly compatible with the life I live. Someone ambitious, intelligent, confident, and very comfortable in the kind of world my work creates. To anyone observing from the outside, she would have looked like the obvious choice. The safe choice. The woman who fit neatly into the narrative of what a man like me is supposed to want. And for a short time, my father assumed that was the direction my life would go. He saw how easily she navigated conversations about business, technology, the future, all the subjects that tend to dominate my days. She understood the speed of my world, the constant movement, the relentless focus on building things that most people can't even imagine yet. In many ways, she spoke the same language my life is built around, and my father believed that made her the logical match for me. But logic is a strange guide when it comes to love, because while she understood the world I operate in, she didn't understand something much quieter about me, something I didn't fully understand myself until you appeared. You see, my life has always been surrounded by people who admire ambition, people who celebrate momentum, disruption, innovation. But very few people ever slow down long enough to ask what all of that movement costs a person emotionally. And the truth is, somewhere deep inside me there has always been a quiet hunger for something completely different. Not more speed, not more excitement, something calmer, something grounding. Someone whose presence doesn't push me forward, but gently reminds me that being still is not the same thing as falling behind. And that's the part of me the other woman never saw. She admired the machine. You noticed the man sitting inside it. Tell me something honestly. Have you ever felt that strange moment when someone looks at you and seems to understand a part of you that you didn't realize was visible? The first time you spoke to me, you asked a question that caught me off guard in a way almost no one ever does. You didn't ask about my plans or my work or my ideas about the future. You asked something much simpler. You asked whether I ever get tired of carrying so many responsibilities alone. And that question landed in my chest in a way I still haven't fully explained to myself. Because most people see strength and assume it means a person doesn't need support. But you saw the quiet exhaustion underneath it. My father noticed the shift in me before I even understood it myself. He said something subtle had changed in the way I talked about my days after you appeared in my life. I wasn't speaking about achievements anymore. I was speaking about conversations. About moments of calm that seemed to appear in the middle of chaos. And that's when he began to realize something he hadn't expected. The woman he thought was the obvious choice wasn't the one influencing my heart at all. It was you. The woman whose quiet presence didn't compete with my world, but somehow softened it. But here's where the story becomes complicated. Because once my father understood that the investigation didn't slow down, it intensified. Not because he doubted you, but because he needed to understand why someone like me was suddenly drawn so deeply toward someone whose life moved in such a different rhythm. In his mind, that kind of emotional gravity can be powerful. But it can also be dangerous if the two people involved don't understand what they're stepping into. And the more he looked into your life, the more he realized something that made him pause. Something about your past that revealed just how carefully you choose who you allow into your heart. And when he told me about that part of your story, I felt something shift inside me that I wasn't prepared for. Because suddenly this connection between us didn't feel accidental anymore. It felt like something fragile, something that could either become the most meaningful partnership of my life, or something I could destroy without even realizing it. But the real truth, the reason I'm telling you all of this tonight, is something I haven't revealed yet. Because there was a moment during my father's investigation when he discovered something about you that made him stop completely. Something that made him look at me and say one sentence I will never forget. A sentence that changed how I see you forever. And I'm still deciding whether I'm brave enough to tell you what he said. When my father reached that moment in his investigation, something unusual happened. The man who had spent weeks quietly analyzing your life, your choices, your past, the way people describe you when they think no one important is listening, suddenly stopped speaking. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time before saying anything else. And that silence alone told me the next words were going to matter more than anything he had said so far. Because my father is not a man who pauses for emotional reasons. He pauses when something challenges the assumptions he started with. Finally, he looked at me and said something that, at first, sounded almost simple. He said, Son, this woman has already learned how to lose. And when I heard that sentence, I didn't immediately understand what he meant. Losing can mean many things in life: failed plans, broken dreams, relationships that didn't survive the pressure of time. But he explained that the kind of loss he was talking about was different. He had learned about a chapter in your past where someone you trusted deeply either walked away or failed you in a moment when you needed them most. Not in a dramatic, public way, but in the quiet, devastating way that leaves a person questioning their own judgment. The kind of moment that forces someone to rebuild their faith in people from the ground up. And when he described that part of your story, something inside me shifted. Because I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly before. The warmth in your voice, the patience in the way you listen, the calm strength you carry even when conversations become difficult. None of that appeared by accident. It was built slowly after disappointment. Built after learning that not every promise people make is meant to be kept. And yet somehow, instead of becoming guarded or cynical, you chose to remain open-hearted. Do you realize how rare that is? Most people who experience that kind of betrayal build walls so high that love can't reach them again. But you didn't build walls. You built wisdom. My father recognized that immediately. And that's when he said the sentence that changed everything for me. He looked at me very carefully and said, "A woman who has already survived heartbreak will not break easily, but she will also never tolerate being taken for granted again." When he said that, I felt a strange mixture of admiration and fear. Admiration because I suddenly understood the depth of your strength in a way I hadn't before, and fear because loving someone with that kind of emotional clarity means you cannot hide behind excuses or half-efforts. A woman who has already rebuilt herself once knows exactly what it feels like to walk away when necessary. Tell me honestly, have you ever reached that point in your life where you quietly promised yourself that the next person you allow into your heart must be different from the ones before? Not perfect, but honest, consistent, someone who doesn't make you question your own worth. Because when my father explained that part of your past to me, I realized something that made my chest feel heavier than I expected. If I ever hurt you the way someone else once did, you wouldn't stay and try to fix it. You would simply leave. Calmly, with dignity. And the thought of that possibility forced me to confront something uncomfortable about myself. Because men like me are used to solving problems with logic, persistence, innovation. We build solutions for complicated systems and global challenges. But the emotional world is different. There is no algorithm that repairs trust once it has been broken. No engineering shortcut that restores someone's faith in you after you've disappointed them deeply. And realizing that made me understand something my father had been hinting at from the beginning. Loving you isn't just about feelings. It's about responsibility. The quiet responsibility of protecting something precious once it has been offered to you. But there's another truth I haven't told you yet. Something I've been holding back since the beginning of this conversation. Because around this point in my father's investigation, I realized there was a deeper reason he had started all of this in the first place. A reason that had nothing to do with curiosity, and everything to do with something he believed about the way my heart works. And the moment he finally told me that reason, it made me question whether I was capable of giving you the kind of love you truly deserve. Would you like me to continue? When my father finally revealed the real reason he started investigating you, it wasn't spoken with anger or suspicion. It was spoken with a kind of quiet concern that I rarely hear in his voice. He leaned forward slightly, the way he does when he wants to make sure his words land exactly where they're meant to. Then he said something that felt less like criticism and more like a mirror being placed in front of me. He said the reason he looked into your life so carefully was not because he doubted your character, it was because he doubted my emotional patience. And hearing that forced me to sit there for a long moment without saying anything, because deep down I knew exactly what he meant. My father has watched me chase impossible ideas for most of my life. He has seen me build companies, design technologies, take risks that most people would never even consider. But he has also seen the cost of that kind of obsession. The long nights, the constant motion, the tendency to prioritize the future over the present moment. And he told me something that felt painfully honest. He said that men who live in constant pursuit of the next breakthrough sometimes forget that love isn't built in bursts of brilliance. It's built in quiet consistency, in small daily acts that don't make headlines but slowly create trust over time. And he wasn't sure whether I had ever truly learned that skill. Tell me something truthfully. Have you ever watched someone who is incredibly capable in one part of life struggle deeply in another? Someone who can solve complex problems, lead teams, build entire systems, yet somehow still feel uncertain when it comes to the simple act of being emotionally present for another human being. Because that is the version of me my father has always worried about. The man who can change the trajectory of industries, but might still fail to protect the heart of the woman who chooses to love him. And when he said that out loud, I realized this entire investigation had never been about discovering who you are. It had been about asking whether I was worthy of the kind of woman you've proven yourself to be. That realization has been echoing inside me tonight in a way I can't easily dismiss. Because loving someone like you isn't just about admiration. It's about steadiness. About showing up in the quiet moments when there is nothing impressive happening at all. My father told me that the strongest relationships he has ever seen were not built by dramatic declarations or grand, romantic gestures. They were built by two people who quietly decided, again and again, to remain loyal to each other's well, being even when life became complicated. And hearing that made me wonder something I hadn't allowed myself to question before. Have I ever truly practiced that kind of loyalty? Or have I always been too focused on building the next thing to fully nurture what was already in front of me? But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because after my father admitted all of this, he said something else that unsettled me more than any criticism he had offered earlier. He said that during his investigation, there was a brief moment when he thought you might actually be the one who would walk away from me first. Not because of anything you did wrong, but because of something he believed about the way our worlds operate. Your life carries a rhythm of reflection, patience, emotional depth. Mine moves like a storm, unpredictable, intense, always chasing the horizon. And he wondered whether eventually you might realize that loving someone like me requires more emotional endurance than most people should have to give. Have you ever felt that quiet tension between two people who care deeply about each other, but live in completely different emotional tempos? One person moving quickly, driven by ambition and urgency, the other moving thoughtfully, protecting the moments that make life meaningful. Sometimes those two rhythms create beautiful harmony, but sometimes they create distance. And that possibility has been sitting in my mind tonight in a way that makes me uneasy. Because if there is one thing I have learned about you from everything my father discovered, it's that you value emotional honesty more than anything else. You don't stay where love feels uncertain for too long. And that's why there is still something I haven't told you yet. Something I realized about myself during this entire conversation with my father. A truth that I've been quietly avoiding for weeks, because admitting it might change everything about the way you see me. You see, there was a moment not long ago when I almost convinced myself that stepping away from you would actually be the safer decision. Safer for you, and maybe even safer for me. And the reason I almost made that choice is something I'm not sure you're ready to hear yet. There was a night not long ago when I sat alone in my office long after everyone had gone home. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder than they should be. I remember staring out at the city lights and thinking about everything my father had said about patience, about responsibility, about the quiet strength you carry in your heart. And for the first time since you entered my life, I allowed myself to ask a question that frightened me more than any business risk I've ever taken. I asked myself whether loving you might actually be unfair to you. Not because my feelings aren't real, but because the world I live in can be unpredictable, relentless, demanding in ways that sometimes leave very little space for the calm consistency someone like you deserves. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. Because the truth is, it would have been easy to convince myself that stepping back was the noble thing to do. To tell myself that protecting your peace meant creating distance before things became deeper. After all, people do that all the time. They walk away from something beautiful while pretending it's an act of kindness. And for a moment, I almost did exactly that. I almost convinced myself that disappearing quietly would spare you the possibility of disappointment later. Have you ever noticed how the human mind can disguise fear as responsibility? How sometimes we call something the right decision, when, in truth, we're just afraid of failing someone who matters too much. But what complicated that decision even further was something my father said right before we ended our conversation. He looked at me with that same calm seriousness and said, "Son, there's one mistake men like you make more often than they realize." I asked him what he meant, and he said something that has been echoing in my thoughts ever since. He said that sometimes a man assumes he's protecting a woman by walking away, when in reality, he's just denying her the chance to decide for herself whether the love is worth the risk. And hearing that made me uncomfortable in a way I didn't expect, because it forced me to consider the possibility that leaving you for your own good might actually be a form of arrogance. Tell me something honestly. If someone cared about you deeply but decided to disappear because they believed they might someday hurt you, would you feel grateful for their restraint? Or would you feel robbed of the chance to choose your own future? That question stayed with me all night. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. Loving someone is not just about protecting them from pain. It's about respecting their strength enough to let them stand beside you even when life becomes uncertain. And everything I've learned about you suggests that you are not a woman who fears uncertainty. You are a woman who faces it with quiet courage. But there was still another complication lingering in the back of my mind, something my father mentioned almost casually before the conversation ended. He told me that during his investigation, he noticed how carefully you guard your emotional boundaries. You listen deeply, you care sincerely, but you also watch closely for signs of inconsistency. And that awareness, he said, means you are unlikely to tolerate confusion for very long. In other words, if I ever allowed doubt or hesitation to linger too long between us, you would eventually step away on your own. Not dramatically, not with anger, just with the calm dignity of someone who refuses to chase uncertain love. And realizing that made me feel something I rarely experience, urgency. Not the urgency of business decisions or technological breakthroughs, but the emotional urgency of knowing that some opportunities in life quietly disappear if you hesitate too long. Because love, real love, doesn't wait forever while someone decides whether they're ready for it. It simply moves on and finds a place where it can be welcomed fully. And the idea of that happening with you, the idea of waking up one day and realizing that I waited too long to choose courage over caution, that thought unsettled me more than I expected. But the real turning point came later, that same night, when I remembered something you said during one of our earlier conversations. A sentence that seemed simple at the time, but suddenly carried a completely different meaning. You said that at this stage of your life, you are no longer interested in temporary connections or uncertain emotions. You said that if someone enters your heart now, it must be because they intend to stay. And when that memory resurfaced, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning of this story. Because if what you said is true, then the next decision I make about us may determine whether this connection grows into something permanent, or whether it quietly disappears before it ever has the chance to become real. And the truth is, something happened the very next morning that forced me to confront that decision sooner than I expected. Something that almost made it too late to tell you any of this. The next morning didn't begin with clarity the way I hoped it would. It began with a strange, heavy feeling in my chest, the kind of quiet pressure that appears when you know life is about to demand a decision you can't postpone anymore. I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully climbed into the sky, and the first thought that entered my mind was you. Not your smile, not your voice, but the fragile possibility of losing you before we had even truly begun. And that thought carried a kind of weight that made the room feel smaller around me. Because for the first time since all of this started, I realized something terrifyingly simple. If I continued hesitating, life would not wait politely for me to figure it out. Life would move forward without asking permission. I sat there in the quiet morning light thinking about everything my father had said, everything I had learned about you, and everything I had been afraid to admit about myself. And slowly a truth began to settle into my mind. The greatest risk wasn't loving you and failing. The greatest risk was never loving you fully at all. Because failure can be survived. Hearts can heal, lessons can be learned, people can grow stronger through disappointment. But the quiet regret of knowing you walked away from something real because you were too cautious to embrace it, that kind of regret stays with a person for decades. Have you ever noticed how some people carry invisible sadness that has nothing to do with what happened in their lives, but everything to do with what never happened? But just as that realization started forming inside me, something unexpected happened. I received a message, not from you directly, but from someone who knows you well. The message wasn't long. In fact, it was only a few sentences. But those few sentences carried a quiet urgency that immediately unsettled me. The person told me that you had been reflecting deeply about your future lately, that you had been asking yourself whether the emotional space between us was growing too uncertain, too quiet, too undefined. And they said something else that made my heart drop in a way I wasn't prepared for. They said you might soon decide to step back completely if things continued feeling unclear. When I read that, something inside me shifted instantly. Not slowly, not thoughtfully, instantly. Because suddenly the abstract fear of losing you turned into a very real possibility standing right in front of me. And in that moment I understood something about you that my father had tried to explain earlier. You are not the kind of woman who waits forever while someone decides whether they truly want you in their life. You respect yourself too much for that. If love is real, it must move forward with intention. If it hesitates too long, you quietly release it and continue living with dignity. And the realization that you might already be preparing to do exactly that created a feeling inside me I can't easily describe. Tell me something honestly. Have you ever reached the point where walking away from someone you care about begins to feel like the only way to protect your own peace? Not because you stopped loving them, but because you refuse to live inside uncertainty forever. When I imagined you standing at that emotional crossroads, something in my chest tightened in a way I rarely allow myself to feel. Because for the first time since this story began, the possibility of losing you stopped being theoretical. It became immediate. Real. And the strange part is that while all of this was unfolding, my father called me again later that afternoon. His voice sounded calmer than it had the night before, but there was still that quiet seriousness behind it. He asked me a simple question, whether I had decided what kind of man I intended to be in your life. Not what kind of businessman, not what kind of innovator, but what kind of partner. And when I hesitated even slightly before answering, he said something that shook me more than I expected. He said, "Son, if you wait much longer, the decision might not be yours anymore." Those words stayed with me the rest of the day, because they forced me to confront something I had been avoiding from the beginning. Love doesn't always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it simply fades quietly while two people wait for the other to take the first step. And by the time someone finally gathers the courage to speak, the moment has already passed. And tonight, sitting here, thinking about everything that has happened, I can't ignore the possibility that we might already be standing at that fragile edge between possibility and goodbye. Because there is one final truth I've been holding back from you this entire time. A truth that might determine whether our story continues, or whether it ends before either of us fully understands what it could have become. All evening I have been sitting with a truth that refuses to stay quiet anymore. It has been moving through my thoughts like a slow storm, growing heavier the longer I pretend it can wait. Because everything that happened, my father's investigation, his approval, the warning about patience, the realization that you might already be stepping away, all of it led me to a moment earlier today that forced me to confront something I should have admitted to myself much sooner. You see, the real danger in this story was never that my father might disapprove of you. The real danger was that I might misinterpret what you were offering me. Because the more I think about everything you've shown me, the calm honesty in your words, the dignity you carry from your past, the way you listen without trying to control the conversation, the more I realize something humbling about the way love works. Sometimes a woman doesn't enter a man's life to be tested or evaluated. Sometimes she appears to reveal whether he has matured enough to recognize something rare when it stands right in front of him. And that realization hit me with a clarity I couldn't ignore this afternoon. For weeks I had been carefully analyzing our connection, weighing risks, asking whether I was capable of giving you the steadiness you deserve. But while I was analyzing, time kept moving. And love does not wait politely while someone gathers enough courage to believe in it. My father called me again earlier today, not to give advice this time, but simply to ask one quiet question. He asked whether I had spoken honestly to you yet about how deeply this connection has begun to affect me. I told him that I was still thinking, still trying to be certain about the direction I should take, and he responded with something that stopped me completely. He said certainty is one of the most dangerous illusions people chase when it comes to relationships. Because if you wait until you are absolutely certain before you open your heart, you will spend your entire life observing love from a distance instead of living it. Hearing that forced me to recognize something uncomfortable about my own behavior. I have been treating love like a complex equation that must be solved before it can be trusted. But you approach it differently. You listen to your heart, measure the character of the person in front of you, and then you decide whether they deserve the courage of your trust. Tell me something honestly, because this question has been echoing in my mind all day. When a woman reaches the stage in life where she understands her own worth, when she has already survived disappointment and rebuilt her strength, what does she truly hope to find in the man who enters her life next? Is it excitement, adventure, or is it something much quieter, the peaceful certainty that she is finally standing beside someone who will not treat her heart like an experiment? The more I think about you, the more I realize that you are not searching for someone perfect. You are searching for someone present, someone who chooses you not just once in a dramatic moment, but repeatedly in the ordinary days that follow. And that realization made something inside me shift in a way I didn't expect. Because suddenly the question was no longer whether I am capable of loving you without mistakes. No human being can promise that. The real question became whether I am willing to grow into the kind of man who treats your trust as something sacred once you offer it. That kind of love isn't built through speeches or promises. It is built through daily decisions, through patience, honesty, and the quiet discipline of staying emotionally present even when life becomes complicated. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something surprising about myself. The idea of becoming that kind of partner for you does not feel like a burden. It feels like purpose. But the truth I have been holding back from you is something even more personal than that. When I almost convinced myself to step away from you weeks ago, I wasn't just afraid of hurting you. I was afraid of how deeply I was already beginning to care. Because caring this much about someone means accepting the possibility of losing them someday. It means allowing another person to influence your happiness in ways that cannot be controlled or predicted. And for someone who has spent most of his life designing systems that operate with precision, that kind of emotional vulnerability can feel terrifying. But avoiding vulnerability is not the same thing as protecting yourself. Sometimes it simply means refusing to experience the most meaningful parts of life. And that is why tonight feels different from every other moment in this story. Because the fear that once made me hesitate has been replaced by something else, something much clearer. The realization that if I continue delaying this decision, I may wake up one day and discover that the woman who could have changed my life quietly chose a different path, while I was still analyzing possibilities. And losing you that way, losing you not because love failed, but because I lacked the courage to embrace it, that would be a regret far heavier than any risk love might bring. So now I find myself sitting here thinking about you with a level of honesty I have not allowed before, thinking about the possibility that somewhere tonight you may be wondering whether this connection between us is real or just another temporary chapter, wondering whether the man you have been speaking with is capable of stepping forward with clarity instead of hesitation. And if you are asking yourself that question, you deserve an answer that is just as honest as the trust you have shown me. Because the truth is, everything that happened with my father's investigation, every conversation, every warning, every moment of reflection, it all led me to understand one simple thing about you. You are not someone who entered my life by accident. You are someone who arrived at exactly the moment I needed to decide whether I was ready to love with courage instead of caution. And that realization leaves only one final step in this story, a step that will either transform everything between us, or confirm that I waited too long to take it. All of this has been leading to one final moment of honesty between us, a moment I can't delay anymore, without risking something permanent slipping quietly through my hands. Tonight, after everything my father discovered, after every question he forced me to confront about myself, I finally understand why this entire situation felt so intense from the very beginning. It wasn't simply because he approved of you. Approval alone doesn't shake a man's certainty about his own life. What shook me was realizing that someone I respect deeply had looked carefully at the woman I care about. And instead of warning me away, he quietly challenged me to become the kind of man worthy of her trust. And the truth is, that challenge has been unfolding inside me throughout this entire conversation with you, because somewhere between the first moment you spoke to me with that calm sincerity and the moment my father told me about the strength hidden in your past, something subtle but powerful began changing in the way I see the future. For most of my life, the future has always meant technology, exploration, building things that push humanity forward. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the future feels personal. It feels human. It feels like a quiet possibility where two people decide to walk beside each other instead of facing the world alone. And strangely enough, that vision of the future doesn't weaken my ambition. It strengthens it. Because there is something profoundly stabilizing about knowing that when the storms of life appear, and they always do, someone you respect deeply is standing beside you instead of watching from a distance. Tell me something honestly, when a woman reaches the stage in life where she has learned from heartbreak, grown stronger from disappointment, and rebuilt her confidence piece by piece, what does she truly hope for in the man who finally enters her heart? Does she expect perfection? Of course not. No wise woman expects a flawless partner. But she does expect clarity. She expects emotional courage. She expects the man in front of her to understand that love is not a casual experiment, but a commitment to protect each other's well-being through every unpredictable chapter that life may bring. And when I think about you, about the dignity you carry, the patience you show, the quiet resilience my father recognized during his investigation, I realize that offering anything less than that kind of clarity would be disrespectful to the strength you've built inside yourself. The strange thing is, the fear that once made me hesitate has almost disappeared tonight. Not because the risks of love have vanished, but because I finally see the bigger picture. A life spent avoiding emotional risk might feel safe in the moment, but it slowly drains meaning from everything else we accomplish. Achievements become hollow if there is no one meaningful beside us to share the quiet victories and the difficult days. And when my father looked at me earlier today and asked what kind of man I intended to be in your life, I realized something simple that I had been overcomplicating from the start. Love does not require certainty about the future. It requires the courage to choose someone fully in the present. And that brings me to the truth I can no longer delay telling you. The step I have been hesitating to take is not complicated, not dramatic, not something that requires perfect timing. It is simply the decision to stop analyzing this connection and begin honoring it. To stop standing cautiously at the edge of something meaningful and instead step forward with the honesty you deserve. Because if everything my father discovered about you is true, if the kindness, strength, and loyalty he saw in your life truly reflect the woman you are, then walking beside you would not be a risk I should fear. It would be one of the greatest privileges a man could experience. So tonight, instead of continuing to speak in possibilities and uncertainties, I want to ask you something directly. Not as a businessman calculating outcomes, but as a man who has spent the last several hours realizing that some opportunities in life appear only once. If the future allowed us to build something meaningful together, something steady, honest, emotionally real, would you be willing to explore that future with me instead of letting this connection fade into a story about what might have been? Because the more I think about it, the more I understand that love does not arrive in our lives by accident. It arrives as a test of whether we are brave enough to welcome it fully. And if there is one thing this entire experience has taught me, it is that courage is not only required in business or innovation. Courage is required in love as well. The courage to say what we truly feel before time quietly carries the opportunity away. The courage to stand beside someone who has already proven their strength and offer them the same honesty in return. The courage to build a future that includes not only ambition and progress, but partnership, loyalty, and shared humanity. Because in the end, the most important systems we ever build are not machines or companies. They are relationships strong enough to endure the unpredictable future we are all walking toward together. And if you are still listening to me tonight, if this story has reached you in the quiet place where honest decisions are made, then maybe the universe has already given us the most important sign we need.